Day one of the American Cup kicked off with tons of decisive action as we've got 16 of the best players in the United States here in St. Louis to play this tournament. I'm International Master Kostya Kavutskiy. I will be providing you folks with all of the action from the tournament, doing daily video recaps here on this channel. Before we get into today's results and games, let me quickly break down the format of the tournament for you all. It is a little bit complicated, but as we get into the event, I'm sure we will start to understand it well. This is a knockout format with a double elimination bracket. So what that means is that all the players, they first start off in the champions bracket, where they will play a mix of classical and rapid games. Each match in the champions bracket actually has 2 classical games as well as 2 rapid games. The games are weighted equally, which means that the best of 4, the player that scores 2.5 points or more, will advance to the next stage. Anyone that loses a match in the champions bracket gets sent to the elimination bracket, where they will then play another 4-game match, this time all rapid. And then if a player loses an elimination match as well, then they are out of the competition. But if you win all of your matches in the elimination bracket, you then get a second chance to actually win the tournament by making it back to the championship final. Now we're of course a long way away from that. Today we just had the first day of matches, and let's get into the results. So starting off with the open section, we saw top seed Fabiano Caruana win both games against his second Grigory Oparin, first the classical game and then the rapid game. Wesley So, he took a 1-point lead in his match against Sam Shankland, drawing the classical game at first and then winning the rapid game as black. Dominguez traded wins with Ray Robson as they are tied 1-1 going into day 2 tomorrow. And finally, Abrahamyan against Sam Sevian, they drew both of their games, first the classical and then the rapid, as they are also tied 1-1. Going over to the women's section, we had a number of 2-0 scores here. Starting with Tokhirjonova, she was able to defeat Jennifer Yu 2-0 in a very topsy-turvy, very sharp match. Alice Lee also won 2-0 against Abrahamyan, as did Paikidze against Zatonskih 2-0. Now that doesn't mean these matches are over. All the players that have not scored still have a chance to bounce back tomorrow. You have to get to 2.5 out of 4 to actually clinch the match. And last but certainly not least, we had the match between the top seed Irina Krush and Zoe Tang. Zoe is actually able to win the first game against Irina in shocking fashion, but then the champion managed to bounce back. Irina, of course, is the 2-time defending champion of this event. She was able to win the rapid game and equalize the score 1-1 heading into day 2 tomorrow. Now going into the games, starting with the match between Caruana and Oparin. This was game 1, which took place in a Queen's Gambit declined. And Caruana didn't get anything special out of the opening here, but he did manage to show some very nice play in the middle game, starting with this move, knight to g5, which opens up the pawn on the f-file for white to advance and start taking space on the king side. And eventually Fabio was able to get a very nice strategic advantage here after this move f5, weakening black's king side. White then brought the rook back to f3, queen comes to f2, and I really like this next plan, g4 followed by h4, advancing on the king side. And eventually white was able to break through here. The attack was very difficult for black to deal with. The king just gets opened up, and eventually white's pieces just become too strong. The rook takes f5 here with some complications, but essentially this knight on g7 is just way too weak compared to this knight on e5. Black tried rook h6 here, a clever rook trade, but after takes, knight takes f5, queen g5 check, and knight to g4. This was the killing blow. Fabiano was able to convert this one as knight f6 is coming and black is forced to give up the exchange, but with just not enough compensation here. Fabiano was able to win this game as well as the second rapid game. Critical moment came here. Oparin was actually doing not too bad in this one. We have an endgame, 2 bishops against 2 knights, but here white goes very wrong with the move b3, possibly just overlooking black's idea here completely, as Caruana unleashes the very nice rook takes e3. And this is just a pseudo exchange sacrifice, because after f takes e3, g5, black actually just wins the exchange back right away. White's rook on h4 surprisingly trapped and has to give itself back. So rook e4 was the only move. But after knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and g6, we get this endgame here that was just very, very pleasant for black. Good knight against bad bishop, a better structure. The king comes in with king to g7, king to f6, and eventually Fabiano was able to convert this one quite smoothly. The king went to the queen side, the knight finds eventually a home on e5, and everything here was just absolutely perfect for black. And here after c4, Oparin decided to call it quits as the c-pawn is just way too strong. Moving on to the match between Dominguez and Robson. Now, Dominguez ended up winning this first game, but actually it was quite complicated. In fact, Robson was doing quite well. This came out of a Najdorf, an English attack. We have the king's castle on opposite sides of the board, very, very sharp position. And here Robson found a very interesting idea with e4. Compi doesn't like it, but of course Compi doesn't understand human practical chess. After e4 is actually quite difficult for white to deal with this one. F takes e4 was played, the knight comes into e5, and after the trade of bishops and f4, all of a sudden black has this beautiful blockade, very, very strong f-pawn. Unfortunately for Robson, he ended up getting into some time trouble here, and despite the position being good, he wasn't able to find the most precise way to keep his advantage. In fact, he soon goes very, very wrong here with this maneuver. Rook to c4, followed by rook to a4, looking to sacrifice something on the queen side, but it just doesn't work out for black. And Dominguez defended this one very well. He goes a3 here, and after knight to c4, queen to c2, this ended up being a big, big problem for black. The rook on a4 is hanging in all of black's pieces. Now we're just committed to the attack. So Ray went for it. The rook takes a3 and knight e3. But after queen d3, queen a5, and just very calm, cool-headed queen takes e3, even though white has to lose the queen here, Dominguez correctly recognizes that after he gives the queen away, he has so much material that he's still completely winning here. He has 2 rooks and a knight for black's queen, and the queen here for black just doesn't have enough counterplay to equalize the game. In fact, I really liked Linier's technique here. After b5, he just breaks through immediately with this move e5, creating a passed d-pawn that is supported by the rook on to d1, and eventually white was able to convert this one just due to the power of now this super powerful e-pawn. So despite winning this game, Dominguez actually lost the second game as Robson was able to strike back. Key moment happened here after rook to d2. It looks like a completely dry endgame. There doesn't seem to be anything special here at all. It just seems like no advantage for white whatsoever. But Dominguez probably miscalculated here. He goes rook a d8, offering up the a7 pawn. And after rook takes d8, Robson does take it. And probably at some point, Dominguez realized he most likely overlooked that rook to d2 here, which seems like it wins back the pawn and gives black a very healthy position, is met with rook to d1, this key counter shot. I would guess that this is what Dominguez missed, as otherwise there's no reason to give up a pawn. And here white would be just a clean pawn up, as black is forced to trade rooks due to the back rank threat on d8. Black cannot go rook e2 or anything because rook d8 check is going to lead to checkmate. So because rook d2 doesn't work, Dominguez is forced to play bishop to b3 here, but now after rook to c1, a very, very strong move. Maybe this was what was overlooked. Once again, black cannot get the rook down to d2 because of the check on c8. So Robson here was able to keep his extra pawn and eventually actually convert the position after Dominguez surprisingly flagged. Although it was a very healthy pawn up position for white. Of course, the game could have continued from here, but in this position, Dominguez flagged and that was it. So Robson is able to equalize the score 1-1 in their match. Moving on to the match between Sam Shankland and Wesley So. Their first game was actually quite an interesting draw. Shankland sacrificed a piece with black, which was good enough for a perpetual and a draw. In this second game, Wesley actually plays this one quite well. This came out of a Berlin endgame, and in this exact moment, Wesley finds a very, very practical resource. Rook takes a3. Another exchange sacrifice, but here black doesn't win the exchange back. After rook takes a3, rook to d3 is just tons and tons of compensation. Bishop to d5 is coming, knight takes e5 is a threat as well, and this endgame ends up being very, very difficult for white. Now to Shankland's credit, he was able to defend this one to a draw, But the problem is, after they reached this endgame with rook against bishop, black just has way too much compensation for the exchange. The bishop on e6 holds everything, is super, super sturdy. Pawn on f7 can't be touched. And in the meantime, the king is coming to b4, and eventually black wants to snag the pawn with bishop takes b3, leaving black with a very, very strong passed c-pawn. And this is just super, super difficult for white to deal with. So king b4, Shankland tries to win back at least one pawn. And the engine says white could have saved this one, but it's one of those defenses that's just impossible for humans to find. Instead, Shankland defends very, very naturally, but eventually ends up getting into a hopeless position and ends up resigning around here. As after c3 is just game over. Black's c-pawn is running down. The bishop is coming to b3 as well to block any checks. And even if white can stop both pawns, the c-pawn, let's say, for example, here, c2, and now king to d2, well, then black is first going to defend this one with bishop to b3, and then play g5, g4 next move. In fact, this ends up happening in the game after check, rook c6, g5, Shankland tried e6, fe6, and that was it. Shankland resigned here as he just has no answer to both of black's passed pawns. So with this win, Wesley is able to take a 1.5 to half point lead in the match, and he'll need to score 1 out of 2 in tomorrow's games to advance to the next stage. Moving on to the women's section here, we had a number of 2-0 scores, starting with Begim Tokhirjonova, who defeated two-time women's champion Jennifer Yu. Their first game here actually ended rather abruptly. It came out of a queen's gambit accepted. Seemed like black wasn't having too many issues here. But in this position, Jennifer plays the move bishop to e7, which surprisingly turns out to be a game-losing blunder. Begim finds all the right moves, and in fact, the solution here for white is quite forcing. So it starts with bishop takes e4, removing the knight. Bishop takes e4, d takes e5, black recaptures, a5 hitting the queen, queen to b5, knight takes e5, another capture, and now after knight to d4, it turns out that black has heavy problems here. Number one, the queen is under attack. The queen has to keep defending the bishop because otherwise white's rook will take the bishop on c5. Queen takes a5, white has knight to b3, winning the piece. And finally, after bishop takes d4, which feels like the only move, queen takes d4, black is simply lost. The queen is hitting both the bishop on e4 and the pawn on g7, and after queen takes g7, black's entire king side collapses and it's just game over. The dark squares here are just way too powerful for white. Bishop d3 was tried, hitting the rook on f1, but now bishop takes b4, queen d6 is coming, queen takes g7 is still a huge threat, and black's king is just stuck on e8 and it's just a completely losing position. Begim went on to convert this one quite quickly here after queen f6, queen takes f7, and ending with rook to c7 check. Just a final little tactic here, which wins black's queen by force. White will soon pick up the bishop as well and just has way too much material. Begim was also able to win the second game in their match, the rapid game, taking a 2-0 lead. Also winning 2-0 was international master Nazi Paikidze against fellow IM Anna Zatonskih. Now in the first game, Nazi was actually quite in big trouble here as black. It's like a King's Indian kind of position, but white just has a huge space advantage and is basically winning on the queen side. Because the king side is so blocked up with these pawns just blocking everything, not giving black any attack, Nazi decides to take on g5, sacrificing a piece in order to open up the king side. Of course, black's position was very difficult regardless, so to me this feels like actually really strong practical decision, and it ends up working out. After knight c8, bishop takes h4, takes on h4, queen takes h4, here Zatonskih had to find the only move, knight takes d6, to keep the advantage. Here white is able to keep the extra piece. She was possibly afraid of queen to g3 check, which is very understandable, and then after king to f1. The point here is that if black keeps giving checks, then white can run away to the queen side with king e1, king to d1, but otherwise black is just not in time here to really generate the attack. Knight g5, for example, could possibly be met with queen to e1, but this was a very difficult defense. Of course, Compi finds this quickly, but over the board for humans, it's very tough. Instead, after bishop takes h4, Zatonskih played takes, and now bishop takes a6, trading off a pair of pieces in order to be able to defend with the queen along the second rank. But surprisingly, after rook takes a6, queen to g2, and very, very strong move by black here, queen to d8, it turns out that black's attack is actually quite strong. Now, white is still up a piece here, but the knight on c8 is trapped. It can't get out. In the meantime, black is wanting to play g5, g4, rook to g7, open up the g-file, and just go after white's king. Of course, queen takes g6 here would run into rook to g7, where white loses the queen, so this pawn can't be taken, and it's just a very, very difficult position for white. So the attack continues, g5, g4, rook a2, black is just attacking from all angles, fg4, rook to g7, knight f6, hg, and here black's pawns end up being way, way too strong. Both players were in heavy time trouble here, so of course the engine is going to find lots of mistakes, but eventually Nazi was able to take over here, all of her pieces coming in. Knight f2 check, and now a very nice trick here. Rook takes d2, forcing king takes d2, queen takes f3. Now black ends up down in exchange, but with so many pawns, and in fact black ends up achieving the connect 4 here, 4 passed pawns with the exchange, and just a completely winning position. So Paikidze was able to come back from behind and win this one, and then she was able to win the second game as well. The players had a very, very complicated rapid game. They reached this end game here, black having a massive pawns on the queen side. It was actually starting to look quite dangerous here for white, but Nazi was able to find a trick that wins her the game. Rook to g5 check. The king went to f8, maybe could have also gone to h8, and after bishop f5, Zatonskih simply didn't have enough time here to find the only defensive move, knight to e6. This would have kept the game going. Instead, she plays c3 here, but after bishop takes h7, white just leaves the rook hanging on d2 because the threat of rook to g8 checkmate is just way, way too strong. And that was it. It's just forced mate, game over. Nazi was able to take a 2-0 lead as well in her match. Moving on to the match between Alice Lee and Tadeusz Abrahamyan. Alice was able to win the first classical game after a very, very long struggle, eventually converting this double rook endgame with 2 extra pawns. Going into the rapid game, Tadeusz had some chances to strike back. We got this middle game here with bishop versus knight, and with all of white's pieces ready to attack black's king, especially on the dark squares. After queen h4, white's idea here was to look for possible bishop f6 ideas, maybe lifting the rook with rook to d3, rook g3 as well, maybe f5, f6, and so on. Not an easy position for black to defend, but I thought what Alice did here was quite clever. So she starts with the move queen to e6. Now Compi here just thinks black should go queen takes a2, just start grabbing material on the queen side and not caring. But Alice was probably likely afraid of ideas like rook d3, rook to g3, some sacrifices, and so on. So she instead starts with the move queen to e6, controlling the f5 square, not allowing white to push f5, and she provokes white into playing g4. Because now after g4 is played, the g-file is closed. So any kind of rook d3, rook to g3 is pointless. The rook is just in the way. And now the g4 is played. Now Alice goes and snags this pawn on a2. Still quite a brave decision, but if black is able to defend against all the threats on the king side, then it's simply going to be game over. Black will just win the game on the queen side. And so Tadeusz tried to attack here with queen g3, but queen takes b2, f5, queen takes c3. White simply wasn't able to generate any real attack here. After f6, knight takes e5. Black just keeps grabbing more material. Nice tactic based on the fact that white's rook is eventually hanging at the end of the line in case of rook takes e5. Instead, f takes g7 check was tried, but now king to g8. Very nice defensive move. Just using white's pawn in order to prevent white from being able to create any kind of serious mating attacks here. And that's it. The threats run out, and black just has way too many pawns on the queen side. Queen c3 is played. We got the trade of queens, king f2, c4, and that was game over. Tadeusz decided to resign here as black just has way too many pawns on the queen side. So this allows Alice to go up 2-0 in her match as well. Once again, she will need just a draw out of tomorrow's 2 games in order to advance to the next stage. And finally, going to the match between Irina Krush and Zoe Tang, this one actually started off with quite a shock. Irina is the top seed in the tournament. She's the two-time defending champion. She's won this event both times that it has taken place. But in this first game here in the champions bracket, she ends up losing to the number 8 seed junior Zoe Tang, her first time playing the American Cup. In this position here, Zoe found a very, very strong move from black, which was e4, opening up the bishop on g7, also opening up the bishop on e6, and this was very, very difficult for white to deal with. Now, probably she should have just taken d takes e4, and then after bishop takes c4, black would be better, but the situation would still be rather complicated. Instead, Irina played knight takes a4, but now things go from bad to worse, because after knight e5, knight on a4 is hanging, pawn on d3 is hit, b3 is played, knight takes d3. Black's just got a completely dominant position here, especially after rook e2, b5, just completely tearing open white's queenside. Krush was in full survival mode from here after knight b2, takes, rook takes a3, black wins the first pawn. Black is then able to win a second pawn, and Zoe reached a completely winning position. Now, this game actually went on for quite some time, and to Irina's credit, she was actually able to defend this down to a drawn bishop of same color endgame. But unfortunately, it was still a very, very difficult defense, and she ends up losing, allowing Zoe to score a shocking upset in the very first round. Of course, Irina is a two-time defending champion and a big fighter. She ends up winning the second game to just immediately equalize the score. This was the key moment. This came actually out of a King's Indian, very, very sharp game, but we'll just pick it up here. In this position, Zoe found a nice move, knight takes e5. The idea that she's winning a pawn. If rook takes e5, rook takes f4, white has absolutely no problems in this rook and pawn endgame. Otherwise, black is going to be playing rook takes f7 here, and things could actually get quite difficult for white, who might be 1 or 2 pawns down very, very soon. But after knight takes e5, things remain tricky. Black played knight to e2, threatening to go rook takes e5 as well as knight to g3 with the fork of the rooks. Knight g4 played, knight to g3. Now all Zoe needed to do to keep equality was play this move rook to d1. A pretty simple move, basically just attacking the rook on d5. If black trades on d1, then white will recapture. Of course, black can take and then take on f7 and keep an extra pawn, but it's a doubled h-pawn. It's not going to be worth very, very much. Instead, Zoe tries the very, very interesting move knight f6 here, but this simply ends up being a blunder. Her idea was after rook to d8, first of all, very precise move from Irina, just saving the rook and keeping the fork alive. Rook to d1. What white missed, I believe, is that after knight takes h1, I think her idea was to go rook takes d8 here, rook takes d8, and now knight e8. Getting ready to promote the pawn on f8 and taking the g7 square away from black's king. But the problem is that black has the saving resource, rook d1 check, rook f1. Not only does black stop the pawn, but black keeps their extra rook and of course has a completely winning endgame. So because this isn't working, Zoe was forced to play rook takes h1, but now after rook takes f7, Irina is just a clean exchange up and was able to convert this one pretty easily. So that allowed Irina to equalize the score 1-1. And everything will be decided in tomorrow's action. So day 2 of the American Cup coming up tomorrow. We have a number of players with huge leads, 2-0. They just need a draw to clinch their matches. The other matches, we could see them going all the way to playoff tiebreak. If any match ends 2-2, we will see a blitz playoff, 2 games each, until we get a winner. So things get very, very exciting during the rapid playoffs. This has been International Master Kostya Kavutskiy. I will be bringing you folks all of the action from the American Cup this week. Thanks so much for tuning in, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next video. Take care.